Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us for From Sidelines to Safety, Protecting Kids from Extreme Heat in Sports and Play, the first webinar in our three-part summer series focused on extreme heat. This series is brought to you by Moms Clean Air Force in partnership with the Nicholas Institute for Energy, Environment, and Sustainability at Duke University. Moms is a community of 1.5 million moms, dads, and caregivers, united by our mission to protect children from air pollution and climate change. We envision a safe, stable, and equitable future where all children breathe clean air and work throughout the country to protect children's health. My name is Maria Finnegan, and I'm a national field manager with Moms based in New Hampshire. And I work with organizers around the country, working on the ground, doing important local and federal advocacy. In addition to the fancy title, I'm a former athlete myself. We spent a lot of time outside in the summer. And most importantly, I'm the mother of a 4-year-old boy who also loves to spend as much time outside as possible. It is now my privilege to share a bit about our incredible speaker, Ashley Ward. Ashley Ward, PhD, is the director of the Heat Policy Innovation Hub at Duke University's Nicholas Institute for Energy, Environment, and Sustainability. Her work centers on protecting human health and enhancing community resilience in the face of climate threats, especially extreme heat. Ashley brings together scientists, policymakers, and local leaders to develop effective, community-informed solutions that reduce the risks of heat exposure. Prior to launching the Heat Policy Innovation Hub, Ashley played a key role on Duke's Internet of Water Coalition, where she led stakeholder engagement and helped public agencies modernize their water data systems. She also spent years working with NOAA Carolinas Regional Integrated Sciences and Assessments RISA team, where she connected rural and urban communities to climate and health data, especially related to risk, resilience, and decision-making. Ashley holds a PhD in geography and has worked directly with North Carolina communities on a range of issues, from food access to climate adaptation. Her passion lies in bridging the gap between data and action, translating complex science into real-world policy solutions that meet communities where they are. Welcome, Ashley.
Thanks for having me. Really appreciate it.
Ashley, we are so excited. We're so excited to have you here. I just want to give folks a quick run of show. Ashley's going to be giving a presentation, and then we're going to stop for a period of Q&A. Please feel free to leave comments and questions in the chat during the presentation, and we will get to them after Ashley has finished. It's now my privilege to turn it over to Ashley. And the first thing I'll say before is I got to speak with Ashley as we were preparing this presentation. And I'm just really excited for all of the incredible insights she's going to give you. My son loves to play outside, and it's been over 90 degrees up here in New Hampshire the last few days. And it's been incredibly stressful for me because, like his parents, he's very heat sensitive. So I'm grateful for what I'm going to learn from this. And thank you again, Ashley. Go ahead.
Thank you so much. So I'm really thrilled to be here talking with this group. I mean, it is true that, I am the director of the Heat Policy Innovation Hub, but more importantly, I'm also a mom too, and my girls are grown. But when they were younger, we spent many hours on tennis courts and softball fields and in various activities and hiking and summer camp. And so my husband also coaches women's sports, so tennis, soccer, golf. In other words, heat and youth activities has been a common topic of conversation in our house for a long time. So let me think about how to get my slides going here. There they are. Okay. Extreme heat is now the fastest growing weather-related threat in the U.S. And our kids, especially those that are involved in activities like sports, but also band, summer camp, recreational leagues, they are all on the front lines. So today's discussion is grounded in the findings from physicians and scientists who study heat-related illness, and our work at the Heat Hub that's focused on translating that science into actionable policy. You can find loads of information on our website, and you can also find a report that we published last year called A Game Plan for Heat Stress. That report looks at heat risk in high school athletics across the country and the policies, and in some cases, the lack thereof, meant to protect young student athletes. So Today, I'm looking forward to sharing with you some of our lessons learned, practical guidance, and highlight how parents, educators, and advocates can push for safety and change in their communities. We'll explore how federal, state, and local policies shape those youth safety standards and how parents can push for those protections. So, I want to dive right in and first kind of start off with a little bit of just heat safety 101. A lot of times we hear people talk about heat stress and heat strain. So just want to kind of clarify what those terms are. Heat stress refers to the external environmental condition that places a heat load on the body, things like air temperature and humidity. But it can also come from other surfaces, the asphalt, tennis courts. It can radiate from buildings around us. Large equipment like air conditioning units also give off quite a bit of heat. So, heat strain then is the body's response to that heat stress. And heat strain looks like elevated core body temperature, increased heart rate, heavy sweating, dehydration, the things that you typically would think about when it comes to heat. Some people call heat stress, which is actually heat strain. So let's talk a little bit about what happens in the body when we start to get really hot. Our heart works really hard at pumping our blood to the surface of our skin. This is because our bodies primarily cool itself through sweating. It's also why you get flushed when you get hot, right? Because all the blood is pooling right under your skin. So you also start to sweat. And when sweat reaches the surface of your skin, it evaporates into the atmosphere and it takes with it the heat that's on the surface of your body and internal to your body and cools your body. So the sweat is evaporating, cooling the surface of your skin. The blood is at the surface of your skin. It's cooling off and it's circulating through your body systems. This becomes a problem because when humidity is high, there's too much moisture in the air. And so the sweat can't evaporate efficiently. And this is when heat starts to build up internally and when the body can enter some dangerous territory. So, what happens in the body when that's happening? Now, when the body is unable to cool itself, core temperatures begin to rise. And as internal temperatures get to 104 degrees, body systems begin to break down. The cardiovascular system becomes stressed because it's continually trying to divert blood to the skin to try and dissipate the heat, and therefore reducing blood flow to your vital organs. Sometimes that sweat mechanism starts to fail, leading to dangerous cycles of overheating. We'll get back to this later. The central nervous system can be impaired. It causes confusion, loss of coordination, sometimes unconsciousness. It even goes down to the cellular level when enzymes begin to malfunction, also leading to organ damage. I want to be clear that heat stroke is a life-threatening emergency. If untreated, it can result and often results in permanent damage to the brain, the heart, the kidneys, or the muscles, and even death. So it's really important that you take it seriously, especially if you start to see people exhibiting the symptoms that are on the right side of the slide here. Confusion, dizziness, becomes unconscious. That's not a moment where you try and mitigate it on your own. That's a moment where you call 911. Kids in particular are very vulnerable to heat stress. Why? There's lots of reasons why, but among them, children tend to be less efficient sweaters and they take a lot longer to adapt to heat. They're also a lot more active in high risk conditions and often rely on the adults around them to help notice when something's wrong, when they should stop and cool off. There are many activities that children participate in. Football certainly is the most cited one, but marching band, where kids are uh, pushed hard in dangerous conditions, where they're carrying heavy equipment. And carrying that load increases the load on the body and actually makes you generate more internal heat. Children also have this very high surface area to mass ratio, and that increases their risk of absorbing heat from those outside surfaces that I was talking about a moment ago, from the environment around them, pavement, and radiating off of buildings. It's also important and less well known that some children are at a higher risk of heat related illness due to medical conditions or medications. There's some very common medications that people take that actually put them at higher risk for heat-related illness. Medications that are used to commonly treat asthma, diabetes, obesity, various cardiovascular conditions. These can impair the body's ability to circulate blood throughout the body. And remember, that's a core way that the body cools itself. They can also interrupt the body's internal temperature regulation, and sometimes make it very difficult then to recognize the symptoms of heat strain. Medications like that are like ADHD stimulants or antihistamines or even antidepressants and diuretics, these can all increase the core body temperature and increase the heart rate right when the heart is already working hard. Antihistamines and antidepressants in particular suppress sweating. So, diuretics increase fluid loss. All of this can lead to dehydration. These things become confounding events during a heat crisis. And it's also part of a misperception of risk. I think a lot of people may think, oh, I've been fine doing this, but now maybe you take medication, an antihistamine or an antidepressant or anti-anxiety medication. Those things reduce the body's natural heat defense mechanisms and can make it harder to stay cool, even when you're under moderate levels of heat. And that's really important. So, parents and coaches should be aware of these additional risk factors when they're present and take extra precautions for children who are taking these medications or have these particular health issues. It's also really important that we recognize the very early signs. The sooner you intervene, the better the outcome is. So those early signs look like really excessive sweating. That's your body really pushing and trying to cool itself off. Flushed skin, like we talked about, with the blood coming to the surface of your skin. But what most people really start to recognize are the muscle cramps and headache that come with this early stage. That's a moment for you to say, okay, it's time for me to stop, sit in the shade, or go into the air condition, cool off. It starts to escalate, particularly if you feel nauseous, vomit. Your heart rate becomes very rapid. I want to be really clear. If you get to fainting, confusion, collapse, that is that's a critical period, and that is an emergency for which you call 911. So, as parents, how can you understand when it's a high risk period outside? I know a lot of us have been taught to think about the heat index. The National Weather Service, who I love, have taught all of us that the heat index is sort of the feels like temperature. This isn't exactly true. So, I want to talk a little bit about ways that you can recognize when conditions are risky. The first is wet bulb globe temperature. Most people have never heard of this, and I'm going to go through a little bit of an explainer here, and we'll come back to all of these other best practices. So what is the wet bulb globe? The wet bulb globe truly is the feels like temperature. It is a composite temperature that does a much better job of reflecting the impact that heat will have on the body, because it includes not only temperature and humidity, but it also includes wind. So when it may be very humid and your body cannot, evapotranspiration is not happening, it cannot evaporate sweat off of your body. But if the wind is blowing, that mimics that same evapotranspiration and can cool your body down just as effectively, which is why a lot of people use fans, for example, to move wind. Wet bulb globe also includes solar radiation. And that's solar radiation from the sky, from the sun, but also from below you, from the surfaces that are radiating heat around you. And what you see on this slide is an example of an official wet bulb globe. There are little handheld wet bulb globe monitors that high school athletics and professional athletics and college athletics use. They're even used in occupational settings. The military uses them. A good one is about $600 or $700 to have a handheld unit. I want to caution people on using the less expensive models. They tend to be less accurate and can lead to some misunderstanding of risk. This is a sort of a description of what makes up the wet bulb globe temperature. And you're going to see in a moment that the wet bulb globe temperature is not the same temperature as the air temperature that you might normally see. It's kind of like when we say it's going to be 95 degrees outside, but the heat index is 98. The wet bulb globe temperature is going to be a different number as well. So this makes it kind of confusing for people. There is a great explainer of the wet bulb globe and a video on our website. I think we'll share all these things at the end that you can see. But I want to give you a couple of examples of when wet bulb globe is a better indicator of risk than heat index. So here's an example of the flag levels that are very common for student athletes. So you can see that when the wet bulb globe, and remember this is not going to be reflective of air temperature, when the wet bulb globe is below 80, safe conditions. When it goes from 80 to 84.9, you're in a green condition. This is like, be a little bit careful. Yellow, 85 to 97, and then 98 and above is red, and over 90 is very dangerous, right? So this is, and there are behavior modifications, and we're going to talk more about those in a minute. But for right now, I want to draw your attention to this white box at the bottom. So here's an example of a day in which the air temperature outside is 95 and the heat index is 93. That sounds like maybe a dangerous day, right? A day where it's going to be really precautionary. However, the wind is blowing. And you see then that we're really only in a yellow flag for wet bulb globe, which means, be very careful. It's a moderate risk. Let's compare that to a different day where we have lower air temperature and maybe humidity is slightly higher, but the wind is not blowing and maybe there is no cloud cover. You have a heat index of 86, which looks like, oh, this is going to be totally fine, especially for those of you who live in the Sun Belt. But it's actually a red flag day. Now, it's a red flag day in this situation because you have higher humidity, you have low wind speed, and you likely don't have any cloud cover, very little cloud cover. So this is an example of why it's important that you not only just look at the number on your weather app for heat index, but when you step outside, ask yourself, how much cloud cover is around? Is the wind blowing today? Where are we going to be practicing, or where are the activities going to take place? On asphalt, on a tennis court, on a grass field? Are we going to be around trees where there's shade? So on and so forth. It's really important as you're trying to assess risk that you take into account all of these components. I also want to point out that when you see heat index reported by the National Weather Service, heat index is measured in the shade. I want to be really clear that people know this. So that means when they say it's going to be 93 degrees heat index, that's 93-degree heat index in the shade. So if your activities are in direct sun, it's going to be a higher heat index than what you may be expecting. Okay, so what do you do about this? Here are some guidelines, for example, that are published. The Corey Springer Institute provides these kinds of activity guidelines. You see them for the military. You see them for each state has them. North Carolina, Georgia, others have their own for student athletes. So it tells you kind of what you should be doing, when you should drink water, how you should take breaks. You can find these for your state, or you can find these generally from a multitude of sources. So this is one of the things that we often refer folks to when they're trying to make a decision about what kind of activities are safe based on those wet bulb globe categories. So the other best practice that we talked about was modification and behavior. And one of the big modifications that people talk about really is acclimatization. Now, acclimatization is the period that allows people to acclimate, right, to these new temperatures. This is especially important early in the heat season, like in May, but it's also important if activities, athletic season, sports usually start August 1st. And so you might have kids that have been home all summer in air conditioning, or they haven't been outside very much. And here in the middle of August, they show up to practice. So heat acclimatization is a process by which the body gradually adapts to hot conditions through repeated exposure over time. And this helps to improve the body's ability to cool itself, to maintain the fluid balance that's so important, and to sustain a level of performance during these high temperatures. Again, the Corey Springer Institute provides all kinds of guidance. And you see here an example of like days 1 and 2. This is one that's obviously for football. You only use your helmet. You're not using your shoulder pads. Think about how this translates to band, for example, maybe just being out and marching without carrying your equipment. And as you move through, you're starting to add on more load. So the real take-home lesson here is to spend the first 2 weeks of these outdoor activities whenever they start, helping people slowly adapt to the conditions. The first 14 days of activity are considered sort of the heat acclimatization period. You can do this at home with your kids before summer camp. Help them get acclimatized to being hot outside at any time as soon as heat season begins. And remember, even if it doesn't seem dangerously hot to you outside, an awful lot of people get really sick, not during extreme heat, during everyday chronic heat exposure, especially if it is hotter than normal for your area. In the Northeast, for example, at this time of year, to have temperatures approaching the 90s is not normal. And so people aren't adapted to this yet. So it's really important that we think through slowly easing our way into heat season to prevent challenges later. So we talked about wet bulb globe, modification of practices. What that refers to is maybe practicing earlier in the day or later in the day, changing where you practice to an area that is, or where you have your activities. It's not just about practice, to an area that's more shaded, right? But the last thing, and the step that everybody seems to miss, and is planning. I cannot stress enough how important it is that organizations have an emergency heat action plan. And this allows everybody to know how they make judgments about what they do and when. And if you think about this, we do this for all kinds of other weather events. Tornadoes, we practice tornado drills. We know what we do when a hurricane is coming. It doesn't make any sense that we don't do the same thing for heat. So, creating a heat action plan helps the staff and everybody whose job it is to help keep your children safe, know what they need to do, when they need to do it. It also helps them identify resources that they're going to need to do that so that they can petition or advocate for those resources to their decision makers. So, our report that I mentioned earlier, A Game Plan for Heat Stress, uncovered some sobering reality. Football alone accounts for 66% of exertional heat illness among U.S. high school athletes. But many schools lack formal heat safety policies, and most rely on sort of subjective decision makers. In North Carolina, our commissioner of high school athletics secured a grant. And with that grant, she was able to purchase handheld wet bulb globe monitors for every high school in the state. So that's the kind of thing that you can petition for at your local level. In this report, we not only analyze or assess rather each state's high school athletics practices, but we also provide some additional best practices to follow that you could share with people in your community, not necessarily high school athletics folks, maybe the people who run your summer camps and so on and so forth. You know, things that seem to make sense, like provide unlimited water access, reschedule activities for different times a day, increase rest and hydration breaks. But again, most importantly, ensure that all staff are trained to recognize and respond to heat illness. Okay, so one thing that's often overlooked is okay, so we're outside. We're not near air conditioning. I hear a lot of people say, if you're feeling hot, go into the air conditioning. But what do you do if you're not in an area in which air conditioning is available to you? So originally, let me back up a little bit. What you're seeing in this picture is an on-site cold water immersion tub, a different type of immersion. This one is a picture that's used very commonly by the U.S. military in their basic training to keep members of the military safe during high temperatures. Now, this is really an interesting development. Originally, physiologists discovered that by immersing your feet in cool water above the ankles, it cools down your core body temperature very effectively. It does, and it works. This is a great strategy for people who are less mobile or aged, who maybe can't get into a cool shower, for example. You could bring some cool water, put their feet in it. But that's really hard to translate that into that kind of science into a situation that's not easy, like to remove your shoes, like basic training boots or practice where people need their shoes on. So the U.S. Army discovered that when you use arm immersion, which is immersing your arms from your fingertips to over your elbows, like you see in this photo, it actually has the same life-saving outcome of quickly lowering core body temperature. This is such an inexpensive and easy way to lower core body temperature. The U.S. Army, which you can find this at the university, the Uniformed Services University, even tells you, and I've magnified this on the screen. If the temperature is this degree, you immerse your arms for this period of time to get a half a degree reduction in core body temperature. That starts to add up over time. That's actually a really significant outcome. And so this is a highly effective way um, to use it regularly. In the military practices every hour, for example, people can stop and do this. I would highly suggest this for outdoor activities for children to have this available to them. There are all kinds of other methods that can be used as well. So if you don't have air conditioning, so this is an infographic that we have on our website, and this is based off of science from physiologists. Certainly, people talk about fans. We already talked about the role of wind and helping evapotranspiration from the body and cool off core body temperatures. But there's also self dousing. So, something I want to talk about here with these next three is water. One of the things you hear a lot of people talk about is we're going to drink a lot of cold water. I'm starting to get hot and sweat, and I'm going to drink cold water to cool me off. You cannot drink enough cold water to lower your core body temperature once you start sweating. Now, it's important that you drink. It's important that you stay hydrated. If you don't, you're going to introduce a whole other set of problems. But if the goal is to lower your core body temperature, water is better used outside your body than in. And you can use this self-dousing. Sometimes you can get in a shower, get in a pool, take cool water rather, and pour it over your body. Foot or arm immersion, which we already talked about. Some people dunk their t-shirt in water and put it back on. Super effective. You can see here too, like this little bar at the bottom where it shows when in different populations, electric fans for cooling inside are no longer a viable way to cool off. There's also a few other ways, ice towels, for example. This is also used commonly in the military where you can take ice towels and put them in a cooler and keep them very cold. Now, it's very important when you do this that you put the ice towel where you're going to have the most benefit. And that is where your big arteries are. So behind your neck, under your armpits, and in your groin, not on your forehead or on top of your head, right? Behind your neck, under your armpits, and in your groin. This helps cool off the blood as it's circulating under your skin in these areas. Misting fans, very commonly used. I want to say something here, though, about the use of evaporative coolers indoor and misting fans outdoors, especially um, in high humid environments. And I'm sorry, I triggered my Siri for some reason. That was strange. Evaporative coolers and misting fans are really great to use in dry environments. I want to say a moment of caution about using these in high humid environments because you're introducing more moisture into the atmosphere, which actually makes it harder to evaporate sweat and it can kind of counteract what you're trying to do. Um, so, again, when we look at these best practices, we think about some of these things that I just told you that can be incorporated into your heat action plans. I want to iterate one more time how important it is to have an action plan. And so, establishing this plan means that everybody knows when to act, how to act, the resources that you need to do so. Okay, so let's talk about what you can do. What are some questions that you can ask the organizations in which your children are involved with? Um, well, first of all, do they have a heat policy? How do they determine when it's safe and when it's not? And what do they do when they hit those thresholds where they determine it's not safe? Is there somebody on site that's trained to recognize and respond to heat illness? Do they monitor with like a handheld wet bulb globe, or do they use a weather app or any other kind of objective measure for heat risk? And then what is the procedure ahead of time when extreme heat is forecasted? These are questions that you can ask anyone who's in charge of keeping your children safe during outdoor activities. So there's what you can ask and there's what you can advocate for. Now, one thing I mentioned a moment ago is the use of handheld wet bulb globe monitorings for these organizations. You can ask your school boards, your county commissioners, the organizations in which your children participate, um, if they can adopt wet bulb globe monitoring and risk based activity modifications that I was talking about just a moment ago. As I said, there are organizations that will provide grant dollars to provide some of these equipment, especially for public schools. But to provide that equipment for an organization that regularly engages with youth outdoors, it's an investment in their safety, just like in any other kind of equipment that keeps children safe. So it's something to ask. Um, and Kestrel, the unit that I think is the most accurate, also has all kinds, that's KESTREL, um, has all kinds of guidance about how to properly use it to know that you're using it correctly. The other thing is you can ask for mandatory heat acclimatization periods at the start of any season. So whether that's the start of high school athletics on August 1st, or whether that's the start of summer camp season in May and June. You can request on site cooling strategies like those immersion tubs or shaded tents or both, or the accessibility to those cooling cloths and fans. And again, do they have written plans that all of their staff are aware of so that they know when to act and how to act? And finally, do those same staff understand heat safety and what they should do in a moment in which it is high heat or someone is starting to exhibit symptoms of heat strain? So it's important that we all start a conversation in our community with our organizational leaders that are charged with managing outdoor activities, partner with other parents. It has been my experience that when parents speak up, policies change. Now, unfortunately, at the federal level, and I forget, oops, sorry, I forget at the federal level, unfortunately, there is no binding federal standard that protects children from heat in schools, sports, or other activities. That's why your advocacy at the local and state level is so important and even more critical. Now, the CDC provides guidance. NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, has a program called NIHIS, the National Integrated Heat Health Information System, which provides loads of technical guidance and data tools that you can find at heat.gov. OSHA, for occupational safety and health, is working right now on a proposed heat standard for workers. That could set some national expectations for on the ground monitoring and prevention that could be translated, of course, to the context that we're talking about. There's also some stuff going on at the state level. Like I mentioned earlier, North Carolina having wet bulb globes at every high school has been a really great thing for this state. Mississippi now requires wet bulb globe be used to guide all sports practices. New Jersey mandates wet bulb globe devices and formal protocols for heat safety. Georgia enforces a very strict heat acclimatization period and also wet bulb globe. Kentucky uses heat index for trigger, but they also use that to then trigger practice modifications. California requires heat illness prevention for student athletes statewide. Louisiana makes cooling stations and wet bulb globe available for decision makers. And so there are actions happening at states across the country. And I think it's really important that you petition in your state and even in your school district at your county level about what they have in order to protect your children. These policies, without a doubt, save lives. And almost all of them began with local champions, whether that's coaches or parents or health professionals who pushed for change. You can also advocate right at your child's school. You don't have to wait for a local or state law. Every school has an athletic director. Petition to the athletic director. Ask and inquire about what their policies are for PE classes when it gets hot in the fall, but also for sports. So a few final thoughts as we close and go move to the questions, because I see there's several questions and I want to leave a lot of time for questions. Heat illness is predictable, and 100% preventable. We already have the knowledge and the tools that we need and lots of examples of how it works. And everyone, parents, coaches, school leaders, policymakers, scientists, teachers, we all have a role to play in keeping our youth safe in the activities in which we are leading. So I want to turn it over to some of the questions because I see there's quite a few in the chat, and allow some time to answer some of the questions.
Gosh, Ashley, that was fantastic. Thank you so much. I was just furiously writing, like, wanting to make sure we had this recording because the first thing I want to do is send it to my son's school because he'll be going to summer camp there, and there's just, in my opinion, a big gap of information, especially in the Northeast. And I'm one of the questions that I want to ask before we jump in, and I think it connects to a lot of these. For folks tuning in from areas that have been experiencing the smoke from forest fires, I'm curious how that smoke comes in and ties into heat. Like, how does that exacerbate the danger, and should people be more concerned on those days?
So this is a great question. You're actually, one other thing I want to circle back to is, you talked about regionally in the Northeast. So don't even forget to come back to that because that's an important point. So, heat worsens air quality. That's absolutely the case. It often acts as a catalyst and accelerates a lot of chemical reactions that come from what's happening and released into the atmosphere. But particularly for wildfires, as you just talked about, not only is heat often plays a role in drought and exacerbates the wildfires themselves, but heat creates very stagnant air conditions. Which traps pollutants closer to the ground, which is where we are, right? And it leads to higher concentrations of these harmful substances. And so whenever you see the combination of high heat plus poor air quality, these are particularly dangerous conditions, especially for people who have underlying conditions like asthma. And I mean, I would even go so far as to say people who take medications who interrupt the body's thermoregulatory process. All of these things, everything in our environment affects, our health, right? Of course. But these two things, particularly these catalysts with poor air quality and high heat, are particularly dangerous for children. So I want to actually turn back. You just said, too, you're in the Northeast. And I wanted to make a point here, which is two things about different regions of the country. I think you could make a pretty good argument that in areas that haven't historically been as hot as they are now, things are even more dangerous. I mean, I know that's definitely when we look at heat illness rates, areas, you see these really extraordinary daytime temperatures in Arizona and Phoenix and everything, and really high, humid heat indices across the Southeast. All of that's true, and it's very dangerous. But when we think about areas of the country that haven't historically adapted their infrastructure to heat, it becomes really challenging. There's not a lot of air conditioning housing, for example. And so what we're seeing, particularly in the Northeast and in the Southeast, east of the Mississippi, is increasingly days where overnight temperatures remain persistently high. In other words, there was a period in which, I know when I was growing up, people who didn't have air conditioning, it might get hot during the day, but as the sun went down, everybody opened their windows, the wind picked up, it cooled off the house, you had a kind of a reprieve. There is absolutely no doubt, both in my own research and in many other studies that have been published since, that overnight temperatures are some of the most significant drivers to health outcomes from heat, especially in vulnerable populations, children being one of them, but pregnant mothers too are one of them. So what happens in those circumstances is when temperatures fail to drop below 75, first, it doesn't allow a reprieve or recovery from your body from the exposure during the day. But second, it sort of combines with underlying vulnerabilities like lack of access to air conditioning or the inability to pay for air conditioning if you have it. And so this is one of the reasons why it's so important that we pay attention to these overnight temperatures. For the first time, our National Weather Service office in Raleigh last year issued a heat warning based on overnight temperatures. So you're seeing the National Weather Service start to pick up on how dangerous these conditions are. And so while I talked a little bit today about, air temperature outside and heat index and wind speed and solar radiation, I didn't talk as much about overnight temperatures. And it's really something people should pay attention to, especially thinking about if you've been at summer camp all day, how are you going to make sure that you recover when you get home? One of the easiest ways to do that is to take a cool shower when you get home. That's a really simple, easy way to cool your body down, even if you have air conditioning, right? And so I think it's really important that people pay attention to those overnights as well. Oops, I've just lost my earplug. Sorry. Go ahead.
Well, I really appreciate that. I mean, it struck me even from moving from the Washington D.C. area where I lived for several years, where air conditioning was more prevalent, and coming back up to New Hampshire, and I had seen the change from when I was a child here, and recognizing how our infrastructure being older, most of the buildings don't have air conditioning built in.
Yes.
And to your point, like in Washington, I could duck into a building to cool down if I needed, and we just don't have that system here, especially in our schools.
Yes, that's an excellent point. There is no federal standard for air cooling standard in the U.S. There's no federal cooling standard. So that means that schools, rest homes, prisons, affordable housing, low-income housing, none of them are required to have air conditioning. Now, they are required to have heat, right? So we have a heat standard in the U.S., but we do not have a cooling standard. And there are a few states who have adopted cooling standards, but most states do not have them. So people like to think that their schools are air conditioned, but the challenge, the truth is they're not. The Government Accountability Office in 2023 did an assessment and found that 40% of public schools in the U.S. lack adequate HVAC. I would love to tell you that all their schools are located in areas where it doesn't get hot. That is not true. They are located all over the Sun Belt, all over the country. So in every district. And this is really tricky because the dollars that are used to upgrade that infrastructure in our schools are borne by the local school district. And so you have school districts where you have maybe they don't have a high tax base to pull off of to fund their schools, which likely means that housing might be aged, right? Also, or you're looking at a population who doesn't necessarily have air conditioning at home. So now we're in a situation where you have children going to school and going home without adequate air conditioning, no way to reprieve. Just what you just said is absolutely the truth. And this translates not only to health outcomes, but learning outcomes. We know that when I think the threshold inside is 78 degrees, where we start to see dips in math and science scores in children. So there's more than, the health outcomes are bad enough, but it's also learning outcomes that are impacted when that happens.
I'm sure for a lot of people, it's just amazing even to hear that, to recognize, in addition to feeling uncomfortable, that it can, impact how children are learning. So thank you for sharing that. And I think, what would be great, having both of us dropped a little negative information there. We had a question asking, are there practical ways for low-income communities to build resilience to extreme heat, especially if they lack the resources for big infrastructure changes like shade structures and air conditioning?
Yeah, that's such a good question. And honestly, I wish I said I wish I had like a concrete, here's the answer. Likely it's a combination of things. And I want to just say for a moment here, the private sector has a role to play, particularly in the environment that you just described, the context that you just described. I think one thing that we need to do a better job of in these communities is going to the private sector to ask the private sector to help in the communities that do lack funding, right? Many of them are actively engaging with communities, particularly organizations that depend on those communities, right? So many of them will actually install things like, or provide grants or dollars to install things like shade structures, or they'll provide wet bulb globe monitors for their local schools. One of the things that I think needs to happen more is I think advocates need to go to for the private sector that work in those communities and say, hey, this is a challenge that we're having. Can you help us resolve this issue? I've seen more and more public and private partnerships on this topic. it's definitely surprised me. And in some very historically conservative areas, there are some really big public-private partnerships going on throughout Louisiana and New Orleans who are providing what's called community lighthouses, which provide air conditioning and all kinds of outreach services for those communities that are low-income communities. The concept of a community lighthouse, it's actually something that's a combination with faith-based organizations and churches in New Orleans, where they put solar panels and battery backup on churches so that even when the power is out, people have a place to go. They also do an incredible amount of outreach. And you'd be surprised at the private sector industries that have partnered with churches to actually provide these resources in their communities. This is really important because churches and schools, teachers and preachers, are really trusted partners in every community. So reaching out to those potential partners in those communities has been a very effective way for people to kind of bridge the gap. And frankly, I'm pleasantly surprised at the examples that we see throughout the country where a combination of philanthropy, the private sector, faith-based organizations are coming together to resolve some of these issues because they're not easy. I think one of the challenges with heat is it doesn't belong to any one person, right? It's not a public sector problem only. It's not a private sector problem only. It's not a problem for civil society only. It's something that we all have to come together to resolve. And it affects all of us. Heat has tremendous impacts on our economy too, right? There is right now, I think, a growing awareness that the heat of how heat is impacting communities beyond just health outcomes, which, like I said before, bad enough. But there's, as long as whenever we're talking about multiple different impacts, that brings more stakeholders to the table. That's always a good thing. And so, for lack of a better way to say this, don't let anybody off the hook. Reach out to everybody in your community and say, this is what we want to do. We want to create a community level heat action committee where we're going to bring together some of the industry that's in our community, the public sector, and churches and other civil society and NGOs, and let's work together on how we can. Miami has done some really great work at actually providing affordable air conditioning and low-income housing. That's a really great example too. A lot of that is funded by philanthropic dollars. One of the things that people can think about too, as we see the federal investment withdrawal in things like LIHEAP, which is the low-income housing energy program that paid for electric bills for low-income households, that program is retracting at the federal level. So, one of the things you can ask for at the state level is whether or not there are state dollars that can pick up. This is really important because it's not just do you have an air conditioning unit, it's can you afford to run it? And so, thinking about how we can also partner with philanthropy and NGOs to make up for what will surely be a gap in federal funding.
Thank you. That's really, I was struck by how it made me feel better when you talked about all those partnerships and the ways that good things are happening. And I think that's inspiring, to your point, like not being able to do things on the federal level, but understanding that you can create change in your own community, whether it be at your child's school or, maybe in a school board or something like that. And that brings me to another question we have. Do you have a preferred or suggested way to get this information condensed and in front of county school boards? How do you suggest taking the next step and getting this in front of people in the local school system, extracurricular activities, camps? Are there preferred resources or a good jumping off spot?
So there's a couple of resources. Just want to throw these out there, and I'm happy to share some. I don't know if you have a follow-up or on your YouTube page, you can comment and put links, and maybe we can do it, or leave it to you all to figure out how best to communicate this. I mean, things like this video that people can easily share are going to be great ways to get information to people. Another way, though, is certainly, like I told you before, the CDC and heat.gov, they do have, NIHIS and NOAA do have guidance that people can rely upon. Our shop at Duke also has guidance on how do you create a heat action plan. In North Carolina, we have worked at the county level and created a template for at the county level for people to create their own heat action plans. That's all shareable and open to the public. We also been working with the UN, and we have coming out very soon this month a primer that helps people work through how you create a heat action plan as well, and gives all kinds of case studies. Um, there are also all kinds of organization. I mentioned the Corey Stringer Institute earlier. They also have all kinds of trainings and information on their website that help people understand how to react and when they're at risk for heat. There are a lot of resources out there. The challenge is right now, I think that they're all sort of fragmented and not collated into one place. So one of the things that we've tried to do, and some of the things with the Heat Hub, is to do just that, right? Just to condense them. We have social media ready to go, infographics on our webpage too, in both English and Spanish that people can use to get out the word. There's also a global heat health information system hosted by the WHO and WMO called GEN, right? They also have all kinds of resources. Now, this is really great because in rural and low resource communities, they're going to look to solutions that you see more likely in other parts of the world and throughout the global South. So there's all kinds of ways to share those links here. And I think, organizations like Moms for Clean Air, who are making this kind of video and sharing it on YouTube, that make it easy for people to pick up and share within their own networks. One of the most important things you can do is just talk about this issue. That is the most important thing you can do to everybody, right? To your friends and your name. Like I said, I'm a mom. I was very active and engaged in schools and camps and everything else. And, just bringing it up often raises the issue to people who are, they're thinking about all kinds of logistics, when they're going to have practice, do they have enough equipment, how people are going to get picked up from this practice or that one. Coaches have a lot on their plate, and they're often not paid very well to do so, or they're working in a volunteer capacity. So as parents, this is one of the ways that we can kind of supplement that, is to say, hey, have you thought about this? This is information that I've learned with this. And so I think there is a role for parents to play in sort of advocating for this and actually helping out in our local communities.
I totally agree. I was just, as you were speaking, I was thinking of a phrase that we use at Moms a lot, mom partisan, being the voice. And I know sometimes it can be a little scary to speak up. You're afraid someone might push back. But it's been my experience that so many people are grateful when you do, right? And when someone takes that first step, others come in, and join in behind you. And there's definitely power in numbers, especially when it involves kids and their safety and health. So, just feeling confident, in yourself as a parent or a caregiver, that if this is something that concerns you, if you're really concerned about your child's health, then you have the right to speak up and start advocating for some of these changes. And I know we are getting a little close to time. One of the questions we had was about creating a heat action plan. You mentioned that you have some of these resources on your website. It sounds like your website has an incredible amount of information that people can go there if they're trying to start this effort in their local community. Some people ask, what are some of the policies or state guidelines if they're looking towards something like that? Do you believe there's room for like a real state guideline? It sounds like some have been made in different places. Like how people go about getting that?
Sure. There are several policy opportunities and interventions. Some of them may not be exactly, it sounds like, oh, I wasn't thinking about this with respect to like extreme heat, right? But certainly advocating for a cooling standard in your state, which would require landlords, for example, in schools and nursing homes to provide cooling up to a certain threshold. These are really traditionally very tricky and hard to do because there's usually a lot of pushback among landlords and homeowners associations and so on and so forth. But I do think, like I said before, parents can be pretty strong advocates for these things. So a cooling standard in your state really does help quite a bit. The other is advocating for investment in programs like the LIHEAP program, which is the federal program, but can be that can be implemented at the state level too. There are also, like in North Carolina, there's a new Medicaid program that allows air conditioning to be basically part of the Medicaid, what's provided via Medicaid. So think about all of the programs and policies that are already in existence and how you can maybe add on to what already exists to make it more robust, specifically for heat, that allows people to get access to cooling and afford cooling. Certainly, I mentioned that in local school systems, a lot of the infrastructure, like upgrading their air conditioning, is borne by the local school district. There are all kinds of grants that the states can apply for that would help, particularly particular school districts. School districts themselves can apply too, and getting the dollars that they need to upgrade that infrastructure. You've, of course, seen and heard, I'm sure, in the news about different worker protections for heat. Those are varying quite a bit by state. It's unclear right now whether or not we're going to see a federal standard there. There is a rulemaking process underway right now, but it's unclear about the timing on that and how robust that will be. So certainly advocating in your state for worker protections means that when the parents get home, right, they also maybe are not quite as at risk. But this also applies to teenage workforce that a lot of people don't think about. And when I say teenage workforce, I mean those that work in food service industry, which is one of the big ones. A lot of teenagers get jobs at restaurants and so on and so forth. And, that's actually a high heat, high risk environment, particularly in the summer. So be thinking about, the jobs that your youth have too. And then I think right now in this moment, it's really easy to feel maybe discouraged about what's happening broadly, both at the federal level and maybe even at your state. But I always say this, and I really want to reiterate that no matter who is in office, the work of protecting our communities to help us be prepared for and respond to the heat events that we're talking about, even in chronic conditions, all of that work is continuing to happen regardless of what's happening in the political space right now. That work is happening every single day in churches and medical clinics. It's happening in offices, and yes, even in private sector boardrooms all over the country. So this is a moment to build coalitions with people in your community, coalitions of people who you may not have thought about before. Bring them together, have a coffee hour, talk about the issue, and build the coalition that you need to address it in your community. What we need are those voices at the community level to keep speaking up.
That's so great, Ashley. I mean, I think in the last few weeks it's seemed particularly chaotic, maybe at some of the federal level arenas, and I think that's where our attention might be drawn. But to your point, things just keep going regardless at the local level. And when you're trying to think about potential partners, think about people who step up immediately, or the institutions that step up when there's a crisis. Look to them in your community and reach out. And what's amazing about community work is people are really open to those partnerships because they recognize that there's a lot of power in numbers, and it's actually really a lot of fun when you get to work with people and make progress on things like this. And ultimately, it benefits not only the community, but your children who you're really, focused on. And just a quick aside, the elderly population, just as vulnerable for different reasons. And maybe there's some partnerships potentially with organizations that help the elderly.
Sure. Meals on Wheels. They're great.
Yeah. Oh, Meals on Wheels. Such an incredible way to get access into homes of people who otherwise you wouldn't know how they were doing. You can check and see if they've got air conditioning there.
Yeah.
That's a great idea. Well, I can't tell you how grateful we are to have made this connection and that you have given us the time to share your expertise. We've recorded this. Ashley said, send it out to anyone you can think of. Send it to your school, your child's school, send it to local leaders. This is really an opportunity to educate people. No one's really trying to get anything out of this except keeping people healthy. So this is a great resource. And visiting Ashley's website at the Institute will be fantastic because there are so many resources there. The recording will live on our YouTube for moms. And also a quick plug for the second part of our series. which will be taking place in July with Ashley. We don't have an exact date yet, but you can already sign up and register for that. It will probably be in mid to late July, and that will focus on maternal health. Ashley sort of introed that a little bit, understanding how extreme heat can, impact not only the mother, but the child who is growing inside, and lead to ongoing implications even after they're born. So I hope you'll join us for that as well. And you can find that information on our website and in the comments. And thank you all again for taking the time to be such a part of this important conversation. And thank you, Ashley.
Thank you.